Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tania Atilano, and I will be presenting today the book Enrique Dussel, Retratos de una filosofía de la liberación, written by Dr. Jorge Zúñiga. It's a pleasure being here, and I hope you all enjoy this book discussion. The book has been published by Herder in 2022, and we have two fabulous commentators today with Professor Frederick Mills and Eduardo Mendieta, and of course the author Jorge Zúñiga. And well, without further ado, I will just give the floor to Frederick Mills. Frederick Mills is professor of philosophy at Bowie State University. He is deputy director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs and serves on the board of the Association for Educational Development in El Salvador. He is a member of the AFL US chapter, and last year he delivered a lecture on Razón Preoriginaria y Sensibilidad para el Otro for the lecture series organized by Dr. Zúñiga in honor of Professor Dussel. Dr. Mills' research and publications include articles and presentations in the fields of artificial intelligence, phenomenology, ethics, the philosophy of liberation, and in particular on Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Mario Bencastro, and Enrique Dussel. Publications on Dussel include a book, Enrique Dussel's Ethics of Liberation and Introduction, by Palgrave from 2018, Dussel Now, and the development of human life in Enrique Dussel's Politics of Liberation. He has also published analysis on politics in Latin America, often in collaboration with William Camacaro for Counterpunch, Eurasia Review, Orinoco Tribune, the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and Monthly Review. So, Professor Mills, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, well, first, I really appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to be on a panel with Eduardo Mendieta, Jorge Zúñiga, and yourself, Tania. So I really do appreciate, and I'm honored by this invitation. This book by Jorge Zúñiga, very recent, 2022, Retratos de una filosofía de la liberación, we can translate retratos, portraits. And I think it's an appropriate title. In this book, Dr. Zúñiga sets out to introduce the reader to Enrique Dussel's contribution to the project of providing a theoretical basis for what we can call critical ethical praxis of liberation. And this is a project aimed at the liberation of the victims and their allies of the prevailing capitalist neocolonial system, and also the construction of a more just political and economic order. Retratos does indeed, I think, paint portraits of Dussel's philosophical works. It provides a valuable companion reader for those with some exposure to the history of philosophy and world history, and have set out to study Dussel's major works. It provides a guide to the basic concepts, for example, of totality, alterity, the analectic method, the ethical principles, and the goal of building a transmodern world. And we're going to unpack these concepts presently, accompanied by Dr. Zúñiga's text. Retratos is also worthwhile reading, I would mention, for Dussel scholars, because it studies the evolution of, we can call affectionately, the teacher's ethical theory, including an examination of Dussel's three major publications on the topic of ethics. And these appeared in 1973, 1998, and 2016. And in addition, Retratos provides an insight into how Dussel's ethical theory has impacted his work on the politics of liberation and vice versa. I think we have a unique window with this book into Dussel's thought, because the author was a student and later became a close associate and collaborator of Dussel. Most recently, Zúñiga has collaborated in Dussel's work as National Secretary of Political Education, Formation, and Training, and this is a position to which Dussel was elected by the National Extraordinary Congress of Mexico's Morena Party in 2020. I mention this because the authors of the third volume, the most recent volume published in 2022 of The Politics of Liberation, were among those called upon to lead some of the seminars on ethics, history, political participation, and all, it seems, with an emphasis on politics as service and legitimate political leadership as involving a commitment to be obedient to the democratic consensus of constituents. Retratos begins with a brief intellectual biography of Dussel. It was in the context, just to address this briefly, it was in the context of national liberation movements, the Cuban Revolution, and liberatory thought in the social sciences in Latin America at the time, that the question raised by Leopoldo Zea and Augusto Salazar, which was whether there existed a specifically Latin American philosophy, became ever more urgent for progressive intellectuals in the region. And as Zúñiga points out in this chapter, Dussel was influenced not only by these currents in Latin American thought, but also by his critical reading of phenomenology, French and German, discourse ethics, and later a comprehensive study of Karl Marx. But as Zúñiga points out, it was the 10 years spent away from Argentina to pursue advanced degrees in philosophy, theology, history in Europe, that this is what brought about a turning point in Dussel's worldview. He had the opportunity to engage in dialogue with other students from a variety of Latin American countries, and he spent time in Israel, where he worked as a carpenter. Most notably while in Nazareth, and you'll find this in Dussel's own autobiographical materials, he had the opportunity to engage in critical dialogue with the Catholic theologian Paul Gautier, who confronted Dussel with the violent history of the Spanish conquest of Amerindia. And to quote Zúñiga, faced with the European ego, Dussel discovers his Latin American identity, unquote. In the chapter, The Return to Argentina and the Beginnings of the Philosophy of Liberation, Zúñiga places Dussel's thought in the cultural, academic, and political context of events that were unfolding in Argentina and beyond from the late 60s to mid 70s. Very briefly, faced with a right-wing military dictatorship bent on quashing dissent, he was ultimately banned from teaching, survived a bombing attempt on his home, and went into exile in Mexico in 1975. And Dussel remarks, Zúñiga, quote, "The philosophy of liberation is an accompaniment of history seen from below, from the excluded and oppressed, from the student movements, social and popular liberation movements, as well as the colonial liberation process in Latin America," unquote. Seeing history from below entailed for Dussel engaging in a critical reexamination of the Western version of universal history, a critique of colonialism and neocolonialism, and a critical geopolitical perspective. Another important influence on Dussel's early formation, Zúñiga points out, was his encounter with the thought of French phenomenologist Emmanuel Levinas, and in particular, the category of alterity. So we'll jump right into these basic categories. Dussel's critical appropriation of this concept provided an important tool for thinking through the relationship between the totalizing neocolonial system and its latest neoliberal economic model, and those excluded and oppressed by this system, referred to generally as the other. But this otherness is not just a pole of opposition within the totality of institutions and practices of the dominant system. The other refers to the transcendent subject who, despite being instrumentalized and exploited, is able to overcome indoctrination and, as a part of a political community, begin to decolonize how they understand the world. This decolonization of one's mind is a prerequisite to the praxis of decolonization. The ideology of modernity, which justified the conquest and African slave trade, claimed a divine right, even a duty, for Europe to colonize Amerindia and Africa and exploit its peoples and natural resources. The critique of modernity, then, is carried out from a perspective that is outside this ideology. It is by means of this categorical opposition, totality versus alterity, Zúñiga points out that Dussel is able to show how it's possible for the oppressed to move beyond naive acceptance of the hegemonic worldview, which justifies dehumanization, and toward a more critical point of view. Dussel is also able to move beyond Levinas by politicizing the relationship of alterity to totality and insisting that the totalizing system is neither natural nor necessary. And this means a new world is possible, one informed by critical ethical principles that defend human life. In the chapter on Towards an Ethics of Latin American Liberation, and that's the text on ethics published in 1973, Zúñiga begins a focused analysis of the first two volumes of Dussel's, what we refer to as First Ethics. Towards a Latin American Ethics of Liberation is, I believe, a critical book because it introduces what we call the analectic method. Zúñiga provides a detailed account of how Dussel in this early work overcomes the ethical impasse presented by Heidegger's ontology. To provide just a moment of context here, Heidegger's ontology in Being and Time describes the lived world in terms of what we can call a totality of sense. What does that mean? Totality of sense consists of a utilitarian network of objects and practices within which we make sense of our world. And there's no outside to this totality, no ethical compass to guide us. Dussel called into question the empirical necessity of the hegemonic totality of sense. And he demonstrated through the encounter with the revealed face of the other, we'll go into in a moment, that human subjectivity resists objectification and constitutes an outside to this totality. So it goes beyond Heidegger and introduces the idea of exteriority, of a point of view exterior to the totality of sense. It's from this outside that one obtains a perspective that transcends this totality of sense imposed by modernity towards a different vision, towards a different possible totality, one that affirms human life and nature. This passage from naive being in the world, which takes the present state of affairs as just the way things are, to a critical ethical perspective anchored in exteriority, is the heart of the analectic method. The analectic method is realized by what Levinas calls the face-to-face encounter with the other. And in Spanish, the term is interpelar. It's an appeal and a claim on us for help, for solidarity. And this face of the other, we shouldn't look at as a mere object, but as a revelation of someone, a revelation of a subjectivity, an autonomous subject who has their own perspective on the world. So in response to this interpellation, the one who's listening can assume co-responsibility for the fate of the other or look the other way. And Zúñiga points out, quoting Zúñiga, the process of liberation supposes a disposition to listen to the voice of the person who reveals themselves. And the ethical is to go towards him or her and serve them with justice, because otherwise the act becomes one of indifference, unquote. So if we assume our co-responsibility for the other, we enter the path of pursuing justice. And this path, as Zúñiga argues, quote, is what maintains the movement of history. It is what avoids the closure of the totality. It is the place from which totalities are transcended, unquote. Zúñiga understands Dussel's discovery of the analectic method as facilitated by the concept of the other as distinct. The other as distinct. What does this mean? It merits some elaboration. Very briefly, for the Hegelian dialectic, there's no distinction in this sense, only differences within a self-developing system. So social and political contradictions can only be resolved within the same totality of sense. For Dussel, there's an outside, as we saw, to this totality, an exteriority from which a radical critique of Eurocentric history and the hierarchies of domination imposed by the prevailing system can be realized. As Zúñiga points out, it was Leopoldo Zea who helped Dussel realize that the cosmovisions and great civilizations of Latin America and other civilizations had been covered over and excluded from the Eurocentric version of history. And it was the work of Levinas, though focused on Europe, which inspired Dussel to see the subject of that covered over history in terms of alterity. In the next chapter on philosophy of liberation, the formulation of a program, this text was published in 1977, Zúñiga draws attention to the geopolitical dimension of alterity and the philosophy of liberation. The geopolitical insight of philosophy of liberation starts with, indicates Zúñiga, quote, the I conquer of Hernán Cortés, unquote, and the multiple hierarchies of domination that constitutes what Aníbal Quijano called the coloniality of power. Zúñiga, citing Dussel, quote, the philosophy of liberation is the counter discourse of modernity in crisis, and at the same time is transmodern. Whereas the ideology of modernity treats the peoples of Amerindia as useful objects, the philosophy of liberation recognizes the alterity, that is the full humanity of the other, beyond this relationship of domination and beyond any form of utility within the totalizing colonial and now neo-colonial system. For Zúñiga, a central insight of this work is that the appropriate point of departure for a critique of modernity is one's locus of enunciation, where one is situated, one's own lived experience of the geopolitical space. In the next, the first version of the Politics of Liberation, completed in 1974 and published in 1979. Zúñiga maintains that in this work, Dussel theorized politics as the principal field in which ethics is put into practice. The prevailing system negates the life of the other and nature, and in the field of politics, one may realize one's co-responsibility to, as it were, negate this negation. In other words, affirm life and nature and construct a new political order informed by a love of justice. Here, the categories of totality and exteriority find their analogy in the capitalist neocolonial center, Europe and the US, versus the exploited dependent periphery, Latin America and other regions of the global South, subjected to colonial or neocolonial domination. In this struggle for liberation, both the popular sectors and allied progressive political parties are necessary for overcoming relations of domination and transforming political and economic institutions to conform with justice. Zúñiga moves from this first politics to a brief but profound treatment of Dussel's comprehensive study of Marx and Marxism during the 80s. He argues that the impact of Dussel's interpretation of Marx as a critical approach to economics was as important to the development of Dussel's thought as was his encounter with the thought of Zea and Levinas. Dussel's reading of Marx adds a new depth to both the concept of alterity and human life. In Marx, the alterity of the workers consists in their living labor and the will to produce in order to reproduce their lives. Living labor, as appropriated by the circuit of capital, is objectified as labor power and used as an instrument by capital to extract surplus value or unpaid labor. Zúñiga highlights Dussel's finding that for Marx, living labor is not completely subsumed by capital, but retains its exteriority prior to and transcendent to capital, and functions as the creative source of value. And here, Dr. Zúñiga mentions the influence of Schelling. Despite being instrumentalized qua labor power by capital, the worker then retains the ability to opt for resistance and change. The other emphasis that Zúñiga finds in Dussel's interpretation of Marx is the unconcealment of the relationship between the enrichment of the capitalist at the expense of the impoverishment of labor. This exploitation applies to the dependence between the developed capital of the center and the underdeveloped capital of the periphery from which surplus value is extracted. Dussel's reading of Marx then paves the way for the elaboration of what is called the material principle in the second ethics published in 1998. In the chapter on Dussel's masterpiece, Ethics of Liberation in the Age of Globalization and Exclusion, published in 1998, some refer to it as the second ethics or the La Ética Amarillo because the Spanish text is yellow in color. Zúñiga argues that Dussel writes in the historical context this time of the economic devastation brought about by the neoliberal economic model. He also takes into account the insight gained from Dussel's ongoing dialogue with discourse ethics, in particular, the work of Karl Otto Appel. Appel argues that there are a priori conditions without which communication communities can't function. These conditions include democratic procedures in which all those impacted by the decisions to be made have a voice. Zúñiga suggests that as a result of Dussel's dialogue with Appel, there's a methodological shift from reliance on the face-to-face encounter, which, remember, that gives rise to the analectic perspectives. There's a shift from that to deontology. In other words, a shift toward a method based on principles that rationally justify ethical obligation to defend human life and nature and advance the cause of liberation. And I take somewhat issue with this view of the analectic method. Dussel argues, quote, Dussel sees in duty a firmer universal scope than an ethic that starts from the appearance of the other as other, located in a specific context, such as the peoples of the South. In other words, still quoting Dr. Zúñiga, in other words, Dussel sees from Appel's critique of the ethics of liberation that the phenomenological ethics of the 70s fell into a kind of particularism or regionalism, while the universal argumentative justification of duty allows us to show why performing a certain act is good, unquote. It's not clear to me, however, that for Dussel, the face-to-face encounter lacks universality. And Dussel makes use of this encounter with the other, both in the second and the third ethics published in 2016. The other, the victims of neoliberalism, of white supremacy, are not confined to any region. Although Dussel does indeed develop ethical principles to ground the responsibility we have for the other and for nature, this doesn't mean he abandons the importance of the face-to-face encounter or analectic method. And this is something Dr. Zúñiga himself acknowledges in the text on later pages, page 136 and 162. As mentioned earlier, the influence of the Marxist concept of living labor as the creative source of value exterior to capital is also incorporated into the second ethics to form what Dussel calls the material principle. Basically, that we ought to advance human life in community and in harmony with nature. In addition, our post-discourse ethics provides Dussel with conceptual tools to articulate the formal principle. Basically, that we ought to use democratic procedures and build consensus in our efforts to advance human life. And finally, the influence of Franz and Kellerman can be seen in Dussel's statement of the feasibility principle. And this is the principle which obligates us to do what's attainable under the given circumstances. And these principles are integral. They mutually determine each other. As practical norms, they guide both what we call the critical deconstruction of the prevailing system and the critical construction, this is more positive, of a more just socioeconomic order. And for those who read through Zúñiga's text, you'll find discussion of all three of these influences on the formulation of the ethical principles. Of the three main works on political theory that precede the latest three-volume Politics of Liberation is a very important text. It's very brief and concise. 20 Theses on Politics, published in 2006. And here, the focus is on the concept of fetishization of political power. Zúñiga points out 20 Theses includes a critique of the Weberian concept of political power, which is based on obedience and domination. This view of governability turns critical ethical politics on its head. For the seat of sovereignty is with the consensus of the people and constitutes only conditionally, constituents only conditionally delegate their power to the constituted power. And what is that condition? The constituted power needs to be obedient to the interests, to the democratic voice of their constituents. Fetishization occurs when those who govern take themselves instead of constituents as the point of reference. Zúñiga indicates clearly that the legitimate alternative to fetishized power is obediential power, quote, before which, argues Zúñiga, the foremost obedient one is the politician and the representative, unquote. And then Zúñiga cites Dussel, quote, obediential power would be the exercise of delegated power of all authority that complies with the political pretension of justice, unquote. The second Politics of Liberation, and this refers to the 3 volumes collection that was completed in 2022, and incidentally of which Dr. Zúñiga was one of the authors of several texts. This incorporates the ethical principles that we talked about. Remember, the material, formal, and feasibility principles. It incorporates them into norms for the deconstruction of the prevailing order, which is presumably corrupt and oppressive, as well as norms for the construction of a new, more just order. So, to put it very simply, in politics, we should strive against those institutions which curtail the reproduction of human life in community and in harmony with nature, that suppress democratic procedures, and that undermine doing what's feasible to achieve liberation. As critical positive norms, again, to put this very simply, we ought to advance human life in community and in harmony with nature, establish democratic procedures for accomplishing this, and condition our decisions by doing what is feasible given the current circumstances. These principles, both critical negative and critical positive, once again, are integral, and they apply to both the deconstruction and the transformation of the prevailing economic political order. When approaching Dussel's third ethics, and this is a book published in 2016, 14 thesis on ethics, Zúñiga points out that when Dussel sees the need to reformulate or elaborate theories for practical fields such as politics, he first returns to ethics as the foundation for those principles. Before beginning the collective project of the third volume of the Politics of Liberation, Dussel composed this book, 14 Theses on Ethics, with a view towards clarifying the abstract nature of the ethical principles and distinguishing the negative, critical, more clearly from the positive, constructive moments of the political and economic transformation. Zúñiga cites this central passage in 14 Theses to establish his position. Quoting Dussel, "In these 14 theses, I advance new working hypotheses, such as the definition of ethics as the general theory of all the practical fields, and the clear discernment of the critical part of this work, the negative moment of the principles from the positive moment," unquote. And Zúñiga argues that this distinction between the critical negative moment of the destruction of the old order and the critical positive moment of the construction of the new order, quote, demands a redesign not only of the Dusselian ethics, but also of his politics of liberation, unquote. He also maintains that this is an analytic distinction because the two moments really, the destructive and constructive, they overlap. Transformation's not abrupt. The old persists even as the new is being constructed. But this distinction is nevertheless practical because we need both critical negative and positive principles to guide this process of transformation. The long-awaited third volume of the Politics of Liberation. Very interesting. This was a collective effort by 28 Dussel scholars, selected and supervised by the teacher. And it was designed to address the complex problem of transition from the prevailing system to a more just political and economic order. Such an order would not be postmodern in nature because not all moralities would be consistent with defending human life and nature. Zúñiga points out that the goal here is a transmodern order. And what does this mean? It means that the ethical principles are proposed as universal. In other words, they apply everywhere, but they can be expressed in different ways by the great cultural diversity of the peoples of the world. This is why the goal is referred to as a pluriverse of communities which, despite their differences, converge on a core set of norms. The authors of the third volume were also cognizant that the geopolitical context of the politics had changed since the earlier versions. Popular and social movements in Latin America and their allied political parties have been faced with the task of continuous transformation in the face of a persistent right-wing opposition. In some cases, progressive governments have succumbed to opportunism, corruption, capitulation to the right, giving rise to setbacks. The Politics of Liberation seeks to accompany those movements toward the second emancipation by providing norms for guiding the practice, as we saw, of both critical deconstruction of fetishized institutions and the critical construction of new or reformed institutions. And Zúñiga eloquently describes this task. Quote, The third volume of The Politics of Liberation is designed for the militant left-wing intelligentsia, as well as to share it with the militants of the progressive left-wing social and popular movements. It tries to provide a foundation for another politics beyond modern politics, unquote. This means one that seeks to bring about a world, to use a Zapatista expression, in which many worlds can fit. Zúñiga closes Retratos with a tribute to a philosophy which takes as its point of departure the point of view of the other, the people, those who have been victimized by Western instrumental rationality and are committed, along with their allies, to the exotic journey of liberation. This is a journey based on a commitment to defend human life and community and in harmony with nature, using democratic procedures in ways that are feasible. Far from being exhausted, because this is the question raised in Dr. Zúñiga's last chapter, the philosophy of liberation is more vital than ever, as, quote, it has been a philosophy in constant construction and recreation, not without its gaps, and it has been of ample reach. It's not static, but rather intent on walking with the reality, knowing that reality always exceeds thought, unquote. Dussel remains today a major point of reference of decolonial thought and the most prominent voice for one of the major currents of Latin American philosophy, one that belongs to all those who seek to avoid a global catastrophe and build a new world. Retratos can help guide those who enter this path of study of Dussel's work along the way.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mills, for this insightful and thorough overview. For all those who still haven't had the chance to read the book, they had right now a great panoramic view of it and an invite to further reading as well. And thank you for that. And so now we turn to Professor Eduardo Mendieta. He's a professor of philosophy, Latina studies, and affiliated faculty at the School of International Affairs and the Bioethics program at Penn State University. He's the author of The Adventures of Transcendental Philosophy, published by Rowman and Littlefields in 2002, and Global Fragments, Globalizations, Latin Americanisms, and Critical Theory from Sony Press 2007. Among other publications, he has also co-edited with Jonathan van Antwerpen of The Power of Religion in the Public Sphere by Columbia University Press in 2011. Habermas and Religion by Polity 2013. The Cambridge Habermas Lexicon, Cambridge University Press 2019. Decolonizing Ethics, The Critical Theory of Enrique Dussel from Penn State University Press 2021. And Power, Neoliberalism, and the Reinvention of Politics, The Critical Theory of Wendy Brown, published by University Park, Pennsylvania, from Pennsylvania State University Press in the year 2022. And he is a 2017 recipient of the Franz Fanon Outstanding Achievements Award. And without further ado, Professor Mendieta, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And Professor Mills, that was an incredible overview of Professor Zúñiga's incredible text. I guess I should begin by saying that I was a student, as well as Professor Zúñiga was, of Enrique Dussel. I met Enrique Dussel in the late 80s when he was a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary. And we became friends, obviously. At that time, he was working on transforming, developing his ethics of liberation. And he was about to be launched this long, almost decade-long debate, exchange, dialogue with Karl Otto Appel. But over the years, I have translated Enrique Dussel. I have edited his texts into English. And so I have a great understanding, I guess, as does Professor Mills and as does Professor Zúñiga, of Enrique Dussel's work. Now, let me zoom out a little bit. Professor Dussel, Enrique Dussel, the philosopher, has made contributions across a series of disciplines. So, obviously, ethics. It is often forgotten that he's also written and done a lot of in the history of not just Latin American philosophy, but also Latin American religions. He has also is undoubtedly one of the foremost Marxologists because he's done primary research on the archives of Karl Marx's manuscripts. He's written in my account, and here Professor Zúñiga might disagree, but it's not just 3, but 5, and I'll explain that perhaps later. Volumes on how to make sense of Marx as Enrique Dussel discovered him. He has also contributed to theology, partly by writing the history of the development of theology in Latin America, but also by writing what arguably it can be called a theological ethics, which is Ética Comunitaria, Ethics and Community, as it has been translated. Additionally, as my colleague, Professor Mills, has noted, he's made incredible contributions to how do we think about ethics. And I'm going to anticipate a little bit my questions. I don't think there are 3 ethics. In fact, I think there are 5, which is, in my opinion, that shows the evolution of someone who has been thinking for a very long time, but at the very least, publishing for nearly 60 years. And so that's really important. Like the question here being, what are these different ethics? And that's not being obstreperous or being punctilious about bibliography, but there is an evolution. And why that evolution? Additionally, Enrique Dussel has contributed to an understanding, as I just mentioned, of Marxist thinking, but tracing the evolution of Das Kapital. And this is a major contribution, which is why he's a most important Marxologist. And there's the way in which Enrique Dussel's thinking interacts, brings together the relationship between philosophy, theology, and religion. And you cannot dissociate them. And Enrique Dussel wrote a fascinating text, Las Metáforas Teológicas de Karl Marx, the theological metaphors of Karl Marx. A text that hopefully will appear soon in English, and it's not very well known. Well, it's not very well known in the English world, and even in the German, although I think there's a translation of it. That's a really incredible text, which brings everything together. Now, I'm not going to go over what my colleague did so eloquently about the steps in Professor Zúñiga's text. I want to raise a couple of issues. Nonetheless, before I move into that, I want to point out that this is one of the best, along with my colleague Mills, wonderful book on Dussel's Ethics of Liberation. Zúñiga's text gives us, as Mills points out, these portraits, these snapshots of the evolution of Enrique Dussel. You might say that there are different kinds of philosophers. There are the philosophers that just have one thought, Heidegger, for instance, or maybe Derrida. And then there are the philosophers that decide, well, maybe I should have different thoughts. And here I think of Habermas and obviously Enrique Dussel. And philosophy is about what are the challenges, what are the methods, what are the issues that you must address. And so I think Zúñiga does this really beautifully. It's a very eloquent text. It's very readable. And it just captures this Lebenslauf, this evolution of a philosophy, which is nonetheless held together by a profound core, as my friend Mills put it, a commitment to the other, and the other here being the oppressed, the victim, the victimized, and so there's an ethical commitment. And then the question is, what are the tools that we can deploy to make sense of that condition? And that's really important, extremely important. I do want to commend my friend Zúñiga, Jorge, for the way in which this text is presented, developed, written, and it covers, 60 years. So this is a really fantastic introduction to this Lebenslauf, this incredible development of a philosophy of liberation. So let me just raise a couple of issues. I don't need to repeat what my friend Mills said. He said it very eloquently and very, very perceptively. Now, I find it interesting. Now I'm going to become critical. Now I find it interesting that you don't talk about what I, in my own work on Dussel, call the mythopoetic or the hermeneutical dimension of Dussel's early work, which is what I consider the first ethics, when he creates a contrast between the Semitic and the Greek or Greco-Roman worldviews, which I think become a thread in Enrique Dussel's work. This juxtaposition between the Semitic, which is the ethics of the desert, as opposed to the ethics of the Greek, which is, I guess, the sea. And those are two of Enrique Dussel's earliest books. And I think they created this foundation for a juxtaposition between being in the desert and not knowing who is going to come from the horizon and having to welcome the other, which is why Dussel then becomes quite receptive to Levinas's ethics, as opposed to what he calls the Greek ethics, which is of the totality. You're either one of us or you're not. And so already way back in the early 60s, late 50s, Dussel had created in his philosophical repertoire a juxtaposition between two kinds of philosophies, if you will. One, which is the ethics of not knowing who is going to come to you in the darkness, in the sun, in the cold of the desert, or who you can admit into the poor of your city that you know and can reply to you in your language, which is the Greek ethos. And then that evolves. And that's a very interesting, very important theme. I mention this because this shows up in the first part of the Ethics of Liberation, Exclusion in the Age of Globalization, or by the way, I translated half of that. And that is the notion that citic-like ethicities are based on certain kinds of poetic orientations. And that's why in the 1998 ethics, which Fred described very well, he begins with this global history of ethicities, Sichtlichkeiten. And in that first part of the ethics, he wants to get at the mythopoetic cores of different ethics, right? So that's really important to hold as a thread, as a holding line. Now, I mentioned this because that's a very, very original orientation that goes back to his work on recur and the history of philosophy and so on and so forth. The other one is and I'm glad that Zúñiga, Dr. Zúñiga, that's explicitly said in the book, that in his book, that he is not going to talk about ética comunitaria, or as I said, translated as community and ethics. And I think that that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. And on the one hand, it's unfortunate because that book of Enrique Dussel was very transitional and also a contribution to the theology of liberation. And I think there are resources for understanding the three principles that are foundational, the positive principles, or the foundational principles of his ethics of liberation, the life or practical truth principle, the discursive principle, and obviously the feasibility principle. But there's a correlation between the ethics of liberation of 1998 and this Ética Comunitaria. I don't know what year it was. It's probably like 84, possibly. And why? Because there is a profound sacramental, I think that's the right word, sacramental dimension to the ethics of liberation. And so I think that although Zúñiga's book is fantastic, there was a missed opportunity there. Now, I understand that my Mexican colleagues tend to be anti-clerical. However, there is a very important thread all throughout Enrique Dussel's work that has to do with an understanding of how Christianity gets creolized, transformed in Latin America, in Spanish America, in Criollo America. So I think that's really interesting. There's a profound sacramental dimension to Dussel's ethics. Now, the sacraments, as you probably all know, have to do with certain kinds of rituals. But I think the most important ritual is the sharing of bread. And then obviously, the ritual of sharing the body of Christ. And so the ethics of liberation is an ethics of life. It's an ethics that is a sacrament, is attending to the other, as my friend Fred put it, that also harkens back or appeals to this notion of the flesh and the blood of something that is holy, and that is the holy life of the other. And so that's why I thought that chapter where you say, I'm not going to talk about these ethics, miss an opportunity to put an emphasis on that ethics is always a form of a sacrament, where we participate in a ritual of life-giving. Well, finally, my friend Mills talked about the books on Marx, and in my estimation, there are 5 of them that Enrique Dussel wrote. Obviously, the 3 books, which are very close commentaries on the evolution of the 4 reductions of Das Kapital, the evolution from the Grundrisse to chapter 1, book 1 of Das Kapital. But he also wrote, as I mentioned earlier, this other book, which is contemporaneous and grew out of his research, which is the Theological Metaphors of Karl Marx, and the Philosophy of Technology, which are the notebooks, the ethnographic, and they're fantastic. There's these 5 books, and they're all written within a decade. And there you have this incredible visage of Marx, the evolution, what Dussel calls the laboratory of Marx, and how Marx is thinking not only in relationship to Hegel, but to Schelling. And then his relationship to all of these metaphors and similes and allegories that are embedded in his philosophical language. And most of it is theological, right? And so that is really interesting. And nonetheless, you can probably read the 3 volumes on the reductions of Capital. But I think that that's not enough. You have to look at the whole corpus. For instance, I think Dussel is one of the first scholars to pay attention to what now in English we call the ethnographic notebooks, which are where Marx is trying to understand the role of technology. And he and his son translated part of these notebooks. And so I think that that's a missed opportunity there, Jorge. It's not a criticism. It's just that you did a fantastic job of synthesizing a lot of material and making it accessible and readable. Now, finally, I love the last chapter, which is on global philosophy, decolonization, and obviously, Enrique Dussel has been a decolonial thinker avant la lettre. You know, he's been one of the figures who has been asking for the decolonization of philosophy, the decolonization of history, the decolonization of the history of the church, the decolonization of the history of ethics. Meaning we have to have cosmopolitan perspectives in all of these disciplines. Enrique Dussel belongs to a generation of thinkers that were revolutionary in Latin American thinking. And he crosses across many fields. And so I'm going to stop and ask a question, which is, what is the relationship between decolonization and liberation? And now, this is a question that came up as I read your book. And the question has to do with what in this moment seems to me like a paradox. Can we liberate ourselves from the coloniality of power, just to put it very bluntly? Is decoloniality antithetical to liberation, or conversely, is liberation antithetical to decoloniality? And this is really fascinating to me, also as a philosopher that thinks a lot about these questions. Nonetheless, it is an amazing text, and I congratulate you. And I thank my friend, Professor Mills, for his incredible summary overview of all of this. So I probably should stop because I speak a lot. So I'll stop.
Professor Mendieta, thank you very much for providing these very interesting points on the mythical thread of Enrique Dussel's work and community ethics, and also for bringing these images of the sacraments, where I would translate it that then ethics is a compromise. A sacrament is a compromise. But then, for example, from the legal point of view, it's very easy then between compromise and obligation, then the line is very thin. Then we will be talking here about ethics as an obligation as well in that line. So this was very, very insightful. And yes, and now we go to Dr. Jorge Zúñiga, who is currently professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and Literature at the UNAM, Mexico City, where he teaches contemporary practical philosophy, Latin American philosophy, and contemporary critiques to neoliberalism. He received his PhD from the Frankfurt University in 2016, and where he primarily participated in research colloquia with Matthias Lutz-Bachmann and Axel Honneth. He was a scholarship holder of the German Academic Exchange Service. And with Enrique Dussel from 2017 to 2019, he coordinated and taught the postgraduate seminar Critical Political Philosophy, Criticism and Deconstruction of the Political Order, in which the volume 3 of Politics of Liberation was collectively produced. He is member of the National Research System of Mexico in the discipline Political Philosophy. He has published several articles and book chapters on practical philosophy. He has coordinated the International Lecture Series in honor to Enrique Dussel in 2021 and to Franz Hinkel-Lammert in 2022. He has recently edited the book Ética del Discurso, Perspectivas de sus alcances y límites, México 2021, and is author, of course, of the book which we are commenting today, Enrique Dussel, Retratos de una filosofía de la liberación, published by Herder 2022. The floor is yours, Jorge.
Thank you for the presentation, Tania. First of all, I would like to, I appreciate the participation of my colleagues and friends, Eduardo Mendieta and Fred Mills, who has placed some good comments and a good presentation of the book and some critical insights like those of Eduardo Mendieta. I thank you, Tania, for this moderation of this book presentation. And well, in relation to these questions and these insights of Eduardo Mendieta, I agree with him in the sense that ethics and community, this book is very important as well in Dussel's philosophy and Dussel's theological thought, no, or theology. I couldn't have it in account in the development and in the writing of this work, because I understand this ethics and community, as you pointed out, Eduardo, in the context of of Dussel's reading on Marx. So I agree that in order to understand Dussel's reading on Marx, we have to have in account these 5 books, no? The comments to the Grundrisse, then ethics and community, then the unknown Marx, and then the last Marx, and finally the metaphors of Marx metaphors, las metáforas teológicas de Marx, the theological metaphors of Marx. I think this is the decade, the 80s decade of Dussel, and I would say that how I understand this ethics in community is we find here a Marxist reading on ethics, or that is how I see this book, no? In other words, is how Dussel sees the ethics from his own reading, from his own Marx reading. No, so I think that's why this work is important. And well, I think that I share more points with you than disagreements in the sense of to having a contest ethics and community. And well, I would say that I will rethink how I can include this ethics and community in a later edition of the book, and I think it's important to have it in account. And the second question you placed is really important. We can understand the question from many perspectives. You were clear in the sense that if it is possible to release from our decolonial subjectivity or the colonial consciousness. Well, I think that is a historical process, no? And of course, if we understand that colonialization is related and with domination, no, with the life of fetiches, no, we have to release from this colonial subjectivity, from this colonial consciousness. And I think that we are in this process, and that's the reason why the colonial turn is very important, because brings some insights that we weren't awareness about that, and now we can be aware about it. So this is a door where we can go into to answer your question. And I think I thought the question are in other sense as well, and maybe what is the influence of the philosophy of liberation in the decolonial turn, or in relation to the decolonial thinking or thought. And I think that philosophy of liberation is an important reference for decolonial thought, because the philosophy of liberation, as I wrote it in the first and second chapter, begins with a critique to the colonial order. So from the beginning, the philosophy of liberation in the Enrique Dussel's version begins with this insight, critical insight to the colonial world, and it developed along the further decades from this perspective. And when the decolonial philosophy, the decolonial thought is growing up, he has a good reference with Dussel, because Dussel provides many critical insights to the ground of the colonial order, in many sense geopolitical, as well as in terms of ontology, or in sense of a theory of subject. In which sense? In a theory of subject, in the sense that, for example, Dussel states that the subject, the colonial modern subject, is not the ego cogito, but the ego conquiro. So Dussel starts with this change in his reading, and then from this ego conquiro, then he understands the Western philosophy, that's the ground of the Western philosophy, and that's the ground of the modern civilization. So I would answer your question from these two perspectives. Finally, I would when you placed this question, I remember an anecdote with Franz Nkelamat, and he told me that he received many insights in the sense that the theology has to be has to take in account the colonial thought, and that other insights that the theology has to be decolonized, no? And the answer in this talk with him, he told me, but Jorge, theology of liberation is already a decolonial theology, and that is the answer, no, or similar the similar answer I can provide now, no. Philosophy of liberation is already a decolonial philosophy, or more clearly, philosophy of liberation attempts from the beginning to be decolonial philosophy, no, a decolonial philosophy. We cannot, of course, we can discuss if the philosophy of liberation gets this point or doesn't get the point of this of philosophy of liberation is successful in this to this extent, or in that sense. We can discuss in which grade philosophy of liberation he achieves this goal, no? But I think, and I'm convinced that philosophy of liberation from the beginning is an attempt to is a decolonial philosophy, or attempts to be a decolonial philosophy. And well, there are some answers, short answers, that I can provide right now to this big question that you placed in the discussion. And I appreciate really to my colleague and friend Fred Mills for this this book review, quite precise what I wanted to place in the on the book. So I really appreciate, and I don't want to forget that I'm really grateful with you, because you Eduardo, and you Fred, you are two of the most important specialists in this topic. So for me, it's an honor to have you here in this book presentation. If you have other comments or other questions, we can take the chance to have a kind dialogue.
Do we have any questions from the audience? No. No? Uh-huh.
Someplace. Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Well, I think the questions are for the speakers, are for all of us, or we can answer something to these good questions and big questions. Well, I would like to refer to the first question, the differences and similarities between Sea's philosophy of history and Dussel's. That's a good question, and well, that's a PhD answer. That is a PhD question. No, I don't know if Eduardo or
I can talk to it, but Fred, why don't you say something to that? Do you have any ideas?
Oh, I defer to you on this.
Well, okay. Are you sure? You were so eloquent. You are so eloquent. Well, okay, let me put it bluntly. Sea is a Hegelian, a hermeneuticist of the Dilthian tradition. And that means and this is how he formulated his position in that huge debate between Salazar Bondi, Enrique Dussel, Scanoni, and his position was, but of course there has been Latin American philosophy, because philosophy is always thought comprehended it's always time comprehended in thought. And so Sea is a historicist. Now, Enrique Dussel had a more expansive conception, or he still has that, which is, okay, it's not enough to say that. We have to do the archival work. We have to do the digging. And we have to understand all of the expropriation and misappropriation. And that's something that is so essential in Enrique Dussel's work, that he goes back and finds these venues, these veins, these repertoires and reposits that have been neglected and just plow over by the Hegelian machine. So there are differences between Sea and Dussel. So I don't know if that explains the difference. But for Dussel, the question is, we need to find what has been expropriated, what has been recycled as European. And I know this because Professor Dussel has done incredible work on finding these writers, thinkers from Latin America whose thoughts have been expropriated and then assimilated and recycled as ideas from Europe. El Inca Garcilaso, for instance, is one. Clarivejo, etc., etc. I can go on, but so I think that there are differences there. I hope that helps.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yeah,
No?
there are some comments, I think. Well, I would like to say hello to Lucas, first of all, and we can continue the discussion in mail or in other space. it's a big question, so we can discuss with details. And then another colleague asks, what is the inspiration? I think of the author, and then what is the objective in this book? Well, first, my inspiration was Enrique Dussel, in the sense that he's my teacher, and I saw the book like a kind of to say thank you to Dussel, because for his lessons along a long period of time with me, and this book is a kind of thank you to Dussel. In fact, I dedicate the book to him, and I wrote Enrique Dussel, mi maestro, con eterno agradecimiento, and it was really so from the heart, I would say. And then the objective with this book, it was to summarize the Dussel's philosophy, and that as Eduardo Mendieta pointed out, it is a philosophy that has been constructed or has been written along 6 decades, more or less. And I have to summarize that great work and big work in 200 pages, more or less. Yeah, 200 pages. So the objective was to summarize this philosophy, and it wasn't an easy task. And then the second objective is to in somehow to place this complex philosophy to any reader. So this is one of these characteristics of this book, that it has to be written with a subtle language and not so complex, but at the same time, in the sense that I am a specialist in this philosophy, the book presents some really quite specialist insights about philosophy of liberation, and in particular Dussel's philosophy of liberation. And that's the reason why, for example, the question of Eduardo, because this question that Eduardo formulated is really from a specialist. So that is another objective to the objective of the book, to lay out a dialogue with a specialist, such as Eduardo, Fred Mills, and many others that who live around the world, in Mexico, in Argentina, in the USA, in Europe. So that is the objective of this book.
No, if we don't have any more questions. Sorry.
No, I just want to underscore something that perhaps I neglected, which is one of the virtues of Dr. Zúñiga's book is that he underscores the importance of Franz Kinkel-Ammert's contribution. And I know this because I translated the book, half of it, and I already knew what was going on as Enrique Dussel was writing the 1998 ethics. However, there's something really fascinating with this interaction between Hinckelammer and Dussel, because Hinckelammer actually used a term, teología económica, or economía de la teología. No, it's you probably know this better, Jorge. He actually wrote a couple of texts, and he was interested in this relationship between religion, theology, economics. And the point that Hinckelammer was making is not simply that theological and religious ideas fit into economics, but that it's economics itself becomes a form of theology. And I thought that when I read Franz Hinckelammer's, that I thought that was, wow, this is so fascinating. He's making this point about how neoliberal economy, this is Franz Hinckelammer's point, neoliberal economic thinking is itself a form of theology. And I thought that Enrique Dussel made a beautiful point of that. And Fred explained the principle, the third principle there, beautifully. But in the background is this notion that there's always some sort of mystification, reification, idolatry going into how we think about the economic realm. And the economic realm for Enrique Dussel is about how do we create the conditions of possibility of the community of life, as my friend very well explained. What is the kind of community that we can create where every human being can be not only alive, but thrive? And so in contradiction, not in contradiction, but in tension with Appel and Habermas, prior to a community of communication, there's a community of life. And if we cannot conceive of that community of life without fetishization and reification and idolatry, then obviously there are going to be victims. So I just wanted to, I failed to mention that in celebration of your book, but that I really love how that you foregrounded that in your book. Thank you.
Professor Mills, is there something you would like to add?
Well, I would just like to return for a moment to Dr. Mendieta's comments about the Semitic ethical tradition, because in Dussel's 14th thesis on ethics, the one published in 2016, there's a beautiful passage about the Bedouin in the desert who sees a desperate human being on the horizon approaching his tent. He's got everything he needs in the tent. But this desperate figure, as he approaches, the Bedouin realizes this person's a member of an enemy tribe. But what happens is quite beautiful. He suspends that ethos, he suspends that finite morality and sees this person as someone in need. And so here's where we have, once again, in the so-called third ethics, Dussel returns to the face-and-face encounter and finds it has universal import.
Great. So if I may, now I will abuse a little bit of my role as moderator, and I would like to make a question to whoever wants to answer. So in my field, which is international law and the history of international law, there is like this big purpose to decolonize as well the field through history, finding new histories from Latin America, from Asia, and so on. And also purpose of this is like, of course, to correct, so to speak, the historical record of the field. But the other purpose is like sort of to start a new international law, or an international law that is not Eurocentric, and so to speak, start all over. But the thing is that the paradox is that the whole language of international law is in itself Eurocentric, everything in it, starting from international law. It's not really international because it started in Europe, and all the categories that international law has, the state, nation, everything is related and started in Europe. So how to start again, or how to think differently a discipline where all the categories and all of the languages are Eurocentric? So my question would be, for an international legal scholar, what would be like a good a book or a work of Enrique Dussel to read in order to sort of find a way to this paradox, how to think international law differently without these categories, but what language are we going to speak then? This is, thank you.
Yeah, well, my colleagues and friends may have an answer for that. What I want to recommend is this book, this collective book, edited by Enrique Dussel, Eduardo Mendieta, and Carmen Bujorquez. This is the Latin American philosophical thought from Caribbean and Latino. I think you have here and the audience that is not a philosopher, and maybe from they are from other disciplines. So this is a basic book, I would like to say, because we have here now in relation to Leopoldo Sea, we have here the history that was covered, no, by the Western history, and we have the historical grounds from Latin America, Caribbean, and from the Latinos in the USA. So this is a basic book I would like to recommend, and this is maybe a start in order to reground the law, the theory of law, and in order to bring another vocabulary for this legal or for the theory of law, no? So that's what I want to recommend, and I think that your question is precisely what we attempt to do from the Latin American philosophy and from the decolonial philosophy, is to make a change in the vocabulary, to make a change in the concepts, in category. And I think that in this sense, the critical Latin American philosophy, such as the decolonial philosophy, provides many lessons about it for the other disciplines. I don't know what if Fred or Eduardo want to add some comments about it, or an answer to Tania's question.
Fred, I defer to you, but I do want to say something. I don't know if you want to add something.
Oh, go ahead, Eduardo.
I think that that's a fantastic question. And it gets us into the issue of what is the philosophy of liberation in general, and more specifically, what is Enrique Dussel's philosophy of liberation and ethics of liberation and politics of liberation about? And the background philosophical question is really a meta-philosophical question. And is philosophy a method, a tradition, a current? So, for instance, you might say that Enrique Dussel belongs to the phenomenological hermeneutical current, that he is part of a Latin American tradition that criticizes Eurocentric philosophy. But I think the most important aspect is that the philosophy of liberation, the politics of liberation, the ethics of liberation, it's a method that foregrounds where we don't see the splinter in our eyes. And it's about, as Fred so eloquently put it, who is the other? Who is the poor? Who's the victim? And that requires an incredible sensibility. And that's what we get as a method from Dussel's philosophy, is who is the victim? And you have to be alert. And as Fred just quoted, who is the person coming in the darkness of the night asking for water and a piece of bread, right? Who is the victim of the system that allows you to live the way you live without thinking ever about these things? Now, at the international level, that requires that we ask, who are the victims of the global system of capitalism, of neoliberalism, of ecological devastation, of climate change, and what are we going to do, right? So method, tradition, current. And I always thought of the philosophy of liberation neither as a tradition nor as a current, although it could be all of those, but mostly as a method, as a way of asking this question: who is the poor? Who is the victim? Who suffers? Who is the person that will come in the darkness of night and knock and say, will you give me shelter? Will you give me bread? Will you give me water? I know that Enrique is very much taken up by the passages in the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it's truly amazing. This is like, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 years old, where before you enter into whatever, hell or heaven, you have to give an account of what you have done for the widow, the orphan, the invalid, or someone with disabilities, etc., etc. And you have to give an account of yourself. So the philosophy of liberation, the ethics of liberation, the politics of liberation is about how have you responded to the appellation or the interpellation of the suffering of the other. And this is a global question. Always, always. But that means that you have to disinhabit, you have to dispossess yourself of your presumptions and say, oh, this person needs welcoming or bread or shelter and so on. Thank you for recalling us that passage, Fred.
Yeah, in response to your question, I think that the sanctions regime being imposed by more than 30 countries in the name of the claim that these countries are violating international law exposes the contradictions in at least those who are implementing or are supposed to be defending international human rights. Elena Dohan, who is a special rapporteur for human rights, went to Venezuela, and she's documented, as well as other organizations, that these sanctions have led to hardship and death for thousands of people. So one of the contributions, I think, of the ethics and politics of liberation is the obligation we have to expose the truth of such things as these sanction regimes and other measures that in the name of human rights violate humanitarian principles of international law.
Thank you for the comment. I don't know, is there something in the floor that are we going to, the commentators or the author wants to add? Nothing?
I would like to thank only the two colleagues and friends, and you, Tania, as well as Brandon, for this effort. And really, it was a good opportunity to have a dialogue with these two big specialists on philosophy of liberation.
So if there's no inconvenience, then we can wrap up. And this has been really a very enlightening discussion, and it very also, I like the contrast, because on the one side, Professor Mills gave us this like big panorama view of the portraits, like the small portraits, but in a panoramic picture, and that was very nice. On the other hand, we have Professor Mendieta, who reminded us of the permanent thread that goes along this panoramic picture as well. And also very interesting, all these images that you bring, like the desert, this person, the stranger in the desert, and so on. So I think this has been really a good summary of what the philosophy of liberation is. And so thank you, the three of you, for that. And I would also like to remind that for our audience that if you want, there is in YouTube also the book presentation made at the Fondo de Cultura Económica in Mexico City. It's available online, as well as the book presentation with an interview with Enrique Dussel at the Herder Publishing House as well. And there is also a review of the book by Carlos Juan Núñez Rodríguez at the Revista de Historia de las Ideas in its issue number 26 of this year. So also you have that as well. And of course, reading the book. And so I thank you all for being here. Have a good evening. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
It's been an honor.
Yeah, it has been an honor. Yes.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.